Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Active Measures. I am Julie Roginsky here with Olga Lautman, and we welcome everybody here, both in the United States, here in New York, where Donald Trump just finished an amazingly crazy speech in front of the United Nations General Assembly, which we'll get to on Thursday on Pax Americana. But today we are here to talk about our latest chapter in our Active Measures series, which documents how Russia interfered in the 2016 election to get Donald Trump elected. Again, wanted to stress the reason we're doing this is not because we necessarily wanted to go down memory lane, but because Donald Trump keeps calling it a hoax and pretending that it never happened. It happened. And one of the ways it happened, one of the major ways that it happened, was something that is the topic of our discussion today, which is the Kremlin, its cutout WikiLeaks, and Trump. So, Olga, WikiLeaks, I feel like, was a big topic of conversation in 16, and then Julian Assange finally got busted out of the Ecuadorian embassy and went back to Australia, where apparently people decided he had suffered enough, and all is forgotten. We have not forgotten. And here I want to talk about Assange and his incredibly shady relationship with the Kremlin well before he decided to get involved in um, effectively publishing GNC emails, DCCC emails, and tried to publish emails from the Clinton campaign, from John Podesta, her campaign chairman, all of which he got from the GRU, which is the Russian intelligence services. So, Olga, do you want to just talk a little bit about Assange going back to when he decided, as far as we know, to to hitch his wagon to the Russians well before Hillary Clinton ever decided to run for president in 2016?
Yeah, so it's interesting because it's via our most talked about Russian outlet, Russia Today, RT, and everyone involved with RT always seems to come out working for Russia and doing their bidding, not only in the information space, but just in general. I mean, there have been espionage cases and whatnot. But yeah, he began his relationship, initially he was independent. He was, one where information was dumped to, and then he would release this information to hold governments transparent. That was the initial mission. And at that point, when WikiLeaks first was launched, I mean, they were very critical of Russia, releasing communications, showing the corruption inside of Russia. But that all came, to an end. And he became so close with Russia that, that he even had his own Russian TV show. And he made his way in developing contacts to the highest level of the government. Um, in order to, by the 2016 election, be used as the cutout. I mean, he was a vehicle for Russian intelligence services to disseminate this information, which then went through the pipeline of all the far right influencers and Fox News. You can speak to that.
Oh, yes.
And the far right media sphere, and then eventually even fell over to he called regular legacy media, who also had to cover it from Washington Post to CNN to everyone else. But I mean, this is exactly how Russia operates. They use cutouts every time that they carry out hacking operations and put out messages, release the messages. They always use cutouts. The one thing I will note that Russia's tactics are always the same. Once they hack information, whether it was the DNC, whether it was Macron's campaign, whether it was in Poland during when they had the Waitergate scandal, um, whenever they release the information, they always fabricate parts of it. So they'll release real emails, they'll release some fabricated emails, they'll release some real emails that have a few fabricated, inserted sentences. So whatever comes out of the Russian government, I mean, they're not doing this and, with the goal of transparency from governments, they are doing this to sow, domestic chaos for the target country, and that is the one thing. So even with the emails that eventually were released from Podesta, from Clinton, you had a batch of real emails mixed with fabricated ones.
Yeah, I want to talk about even before he got that RT show, and he got that RT show, so understand what was going on. In 2010, Chelsea Manning worked military and hacked into or got access to a whole bunch of emails from the State Department. And those emails were given to WikiLeaks, which published them. Um, Around the same time, Assange was accused of sexual assault in Sweden, virtually right after he published those WikiLeaks emails. Now, he claims that he was set up as punishment for publishing those emails. Sweden obviously argued that no, he had sexually assaulted people. Be that as it may, he decided to he was first under house arrest in Britain, and then he decided that he was going to get extradited to Sweden. So he took refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy because Ecuador, I guess, doesn't have some sort of reciprocal agreement to extradite him. While he was hiding out in the Ecuadorian embassy, where he spent years and years and years, he or even before he was hiding out in the Ecuadorian embassy, there was a very shadowy figure named Israel Shamir. And I know it sounds like a Jewish name. It was an alias. Um, this is somebody who went by a bunch of different names. Yorhan Jermas, Adam Armash, Israel Schmerler, which apparently was his real name, Vasily Krasevsky, Robert David. Anyway, this guy was a Russian Swedish national, apparently, who was basically an agent of either Russia or Belarus, but I repeat myself. And he hooked up with Assange. And he hooked up with Assange so much so that after WikiLeaks published around 250,000 U.S. State Department cables, which caused tremendous, and don't forget, Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, so this was kind of on her. Caused tremendous problems for her, which of course made Vladimir Putin very happy with our own allies. I actually ended up working for somebody later who was the ambassador to Germany at the time. His cables were leaked, and a lot of things that he said about Angela Merkel as ambassador were embarrassing, and other stuff that just created a lot of friction between the United States and its allies, and not just its allies, but others around the world, which of course was music to the Kremlin's ears. And that happened. The first batch of those emails was released on November 28th of that year. On November 29th, Assange drafted a letter of authority to the Russian consulate in London, which he signed the following day, empowering, and I quote, my friend Israel Shamir to drop off and collect Assange's passport in order to get a visa from the Russian consulate in London. The following day, the day of his letter asking Shamir to get a Russian visa, Interpol issued a red notice seeking Assange's arrest in the Swedish rape allegations, so he could not leave. There was no way he was going to be able to travel to Russia. But he was trying to get to the Kremlin, to Moscow at the time, after dumping these emails in 2010. He then holds up at the Ecuadorian embassy, and where he's visited by a whole bunch of interesting people. He's visited by the head of RT twice, Margarita Simeon. He's visited by Paul Manafort, although Manafort denied it, but that is in the visitor logs right before the 2016 election. He's visited by a whole bunch of RT staffers, including the head of its London bureau, consistently. He does have the show in 2016, and after all that happens, PayPal and others cut off Visa, MasterCard cut off financial access so that he can't make money. So he is an early adapter of crypto. We don't know if the Russians or any of their cutouts gave him funding through the crypto, but we do know they gave him funding through his RT show. And that is a fact. And he got paid to spew propaganda um, on that. This guy, Israel Shamir, basically said about him to the Russian news services radio, and I quote, Russia would be one of those places where he and his organization, he being Assange, would be comfortable operating. And in response to whether Assange had friends in the Kremlin, and again, this is a Russian news service asking, Shamir smiled and answered, let's hope that's the case. I mean, the funny thing about the Russians is they kind of want to stick it to you to show
Mhm.
you who's responsible, Olga, I think.
Always.
Yeah, always.
Oh, they always, it's the same thing. They always carry out operations, with plausible deniability, but then they always like to um, stick it to you and mention something like they, officially said, oh, we never attacked the 2016 election yet.
Yeah.
Show after show after show. Oh, our Trump. Oh, look, we got him elected. He has to do this. So, I mean, again, this is going through their state media, but they have the plausible deniability, and then they use the state media to, push that. Ecuador also is an interesting choice because the former president Morales was a Kremlin puppet. So this is why the Ecuadorian embassy was
Yeah.
chosen. And interestingly enough, with him, he after I believe lost the presidency, he was offered a show for RT. So there was a reason for that. And Assange was so important to Russia that there were reports that Russia even planned an exfiltration operation in order to yank him out of the embassy and take him to Moscow. I mean, they're excellent with the exfiltrating people. It's happened, within the past few years in Italy. They managed to get one of their operatives out. But this is how important he was to them. They considered, because Russia exfiltrates people only who are their operatives. They don't do it for just random people. It's too risky. You're exposing, a whole network of agents potentially. The fact that these talks were at the highest level of the government to figure out how to get him out and bring him to Russia, in order to make his life easier for the services he had provided for the 2016 election. And I mean, it wasn't just the 2016 election. I mean,
It goes back to 2010. It goes back to
yeah,
completely humiliating and embarrassing the government of the United States and creating tension among the United States and its friends around the world.
yeah.
Um, I want to go back to I want to actually focus on the hack in 2016, because that hack, you might argue, was the defining thing in a close election that got Trump elected. I mean, there were many factors that went into it, but I'm going to explain why. And I think we need to set the table here. The first attempt to hack into the Democratic National Committee by Russian intelligence took place in 2015. There was a something called Cozy Bear, which was tied to Russia's SVR, to their foreign intelligence, gained access to DNC servers in the summer of 2015. So about 15 months or so before the November election in 2016, just as Trump was announcing his candidacy. Timed to very much to when Trump was announcing his candidacy. The second Russian unit to attack the DNC, known as Fancy Bear, which was tied to the GRU, which is Russian military intelligence, arrived in April of 2016. And that August, the FBI notified the DNC of the breach. I remember it was in the papers. But you know, it was kind of too late by then. And that fall, right as the election was heating up, Russian-linked phishing attempts sent spam to Clinton's campaign and to her private account in the hopes of accessing her campaign. So by mid-2016, they pretty much already penetrated, two GRU units penetrated the DNC, the DCCC, the Democratic National Campaign Committee, and senior Clinton staffers they were using spearheading and phishing malware, and they extracted a trove of documents. And that operation used online personas, specifically DC Leaks and Guccifer 2.0, none of whom existed. This was Russian intelligence that has been proven over and over again. That's not debatable. To stage and launder the releases. And Guccifer 2.0 reached out to WikiLeaks and transmitted encrypted instructions to access a trove of that information. That information was released right when the Democratic National Convention began. And if you remember what was going on at the Democratic National Convention, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton were running against each other virtually till the end, virtually till the day that convention started. And there was a tremendous amount of antipathy towards the Clinton campaign by people connected to Sanders. And I was at that convention. I was covering it for Fox. And on the floor of that convention, you had Bernie supporters staging kind of a staging protests, for lack of a better word. The reason that WikiLeaks released it then was to show and to sow dissent between the Sanders camp and the Clintons camp so that they could not unify the convention to go forward. Because, of course, if the Democrats were disunified, it would really help the Republicans, in this case, Donald Trump, win that election, which is what happened. So 3 days before the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, WikiLeaks published over 44,000 emails and over 17,000 attachments from top DNC officials, which was like a huge political shock. And they show that actually the DNC inappropriately was putting its fingers on the scale for Clinton, which of course was just more fodder for the Sanders folks to believe that they had been deprived of this nomination unfairly. There was some truth to that from what the DNC was doing. But it created dissension at a time when, of course, Democrats were trying to unite. It led to the resignation of Debbie Wasserman Schultz within 48 hours, who was the chair of the DNC. And, it created just a lot of tension going into that election. In September of 2016, and I'm just setting the table here, Olga, and then we could talk about it. In September 2016, as it was leaking information to harm the Clinton campaign, WikiLeaks also reached out to Donald Trump Jr. and via direct messages on Twitter. It asked for a bunch of things: Trump's tax returns. It asked for, urged the Trump campaign, maybe putting this idea into their ear originally. They assumed that Trump was going to lose, so they suggested that Trump not accept that the Trump campaign reject the results of the election as rigged on election day. Further sowing dissent. And of course, that was exactly what Trump was going to do had he lost. It's exactly what he did in 2020. And after the election, after Trump won, they asked Donald Trump Jr. to ask Australia to appoint Assange, who was, again, hiding out in the Ecuadorian embassy, as its ambassador to the United Nations, which would have been a big middle finger, obviously, to the United States, which is trying to extradite him. And would have been a reward for his role in helping to get Trump elected. So, Olga, I just want to say one more thing, and then we can talk about it. On October 7th, talk about the October surprise, the Trump Access Hollywood tape drops. And if you remember when that was going on, everybody wrote Trump off. They said, this is it. This is the death knell. Republicans came out and said, we're not supporting him. I mean, it was just brutal. Well, so that afternoon, hours after U.S. intelligence agencies had issued a joint statement saying that Russia was responsible for the DNC hacks, WikiLeaks began to release emails it hacked from the Clinton campaign chairman, John Podesta. And what was so ridiculous about these hacks is that Podesta didn't really say anything. Some of it was like a risotto recipe. Some of it was just scheduling. It was stupid and completely pointless. But what WikiLeaks did so brilliantly, and I believe Russian intelligence was behind this, it did it in tranches. So it was Podesta emails 1, Podesta emails 2, Podesta emails 3, so that the media here, starting with the New York Times, would keep waiting for it every day and writing about it every day, anticipating that something more and more and more was going to come out. And there's an analysis of Twitter's trending topics leading up to the election. And this is important. Podesta related hashtags trended almost 2,000 times and stayed on US trending lists every day in the 30 days before election day, which means that they set the agenda. The New York Times, and this is important, the New York Times wrote about this more than it wrote about anything else, any policy issues, nothing else. You want to know how she got elected? Call the New York Times. How Trump got elected? Call the New York Times, which fell for it in the same way they fell for Russian disinformation under Stalin in the 1930s, which we talked about in our first episode. They fell for it again. And, this is the paper record. And in just 6 days, the Times ran as many email cover stories derived from this GRU hack as it did on all policy issues in the 69 days before the election. All about Podesta for the most part. And of course, right-leaning media accounts and social networks served as the perfect useful idiots for this kind of particular Kremlin operation, Olga. And that's what I really want to talk about. How brilliantly the Russians know our media, how brilliantly they know us, how well they know how to manipulate us, and how much the media keeps falling for it over and over and over again. And if I may say, last Sunday, you saw an example of that again when they went wall-to-wall coverage with for Charlie Kirk's memorial, which was much less of a memorial than a MAGA propaganda rally. And they're doing it again, and they did not learn their lesson in 16, and I want to know what you think about that.
I mean, they continue doing this, and they really should take our disinformation and information warfare course because I feel like over the past decade, I as much call out U.S. media as I do um, the Russians because you have a lot of, U.S. media who continues doing the bidding of the Russians unwittingly. In this case, a lot of the journalists just simply don't know what they're doing and they're just repeating Russian talking points without realizing. Someone asked an interesting question: had Bernie been nominated if Trump would have won? I think chances are that Trump may have lost because Russia had developed an operation specifically against Hillary Clinton. And the operation was, they began hatching this operation in 2008, and they used every single path that they can, as we laid out in the series, whether it was through the evangelical NRA, Jill Stein, Bernie Sanders supporters. They had a whole Bernie bot network. So potentially had, last minute Bernie gotten the nomination, Russia just simply wouldn't have been prepared, which is a perfect example of what happened last year. When Biden dropped out. Russia had, from 2020, they were specifically laying the groundwork with operations to make sure Biden is defeated. And I monitored that whole time period after, Biden dropped out and Harris was nominated. And I mean, the Russians were scrambling. Again, we're too polarized now in 2024. We were too polarized, and the Russians really didn't have to do much because they already had laid the seeds of the division and polarization. But it was fascinating to see how they were scrambling because they had nothing prepared for Harris. I mean, even in their chatter, they were trying to quickly scramble calling political scientists and try to get a grasp of even who she is. Because prior to her being the nominee, literally I ran all Russian media and she was barely mentioned. One, because she's a woman. Two, because she's a Black woman. And they completely dismissed her. So there was not enough, of them to have preparations to develop specific operations towards her. I mean, they tried with the deep fake videos of, that she was involved in a hit and run, which ended up being a complete lie and I mean, a fabricated story, a fabricated outlet, and a fabricated video. But so going back to the 2016, I mean, potentially at that time, Bernie may have won. We will never know. We can't rerun it. But just the fact that they didn't have Bernie specific operations, only operations involving surrounding Bernie just to use him as another tool to make sure that Hillary doesn't win and that the Democratic campaign is
Yeah.
a Democratic Party is split. So, an answer to that question. Um, and then as far as, look, this is Russia's motto. This is what they do. This is how their operations, you know, run. And I mean, eh, w- what's interesting, you touched on October 7th. I have always believed that, that Hollywood Access Hollywood tape specifically came out to disrupt the um intelligence assessment. Because that morning there was a key meeting on this intelligence assessment, where all intelligence agencies were in agreement about the hacks, but not only the hacks, the ongoing Russian attack. Now, this is Friday morning. Had nothing else happened, we would have gone into the weekend cycle talking about Russia attacking our election, that they were behind the DNC hacks, that WikiLeaks is already beginning, at that time, it had already released information. Instead, we were covering the Access Hollywood, and then from there, the Podesta emails being dumped. So I've always thought, for Trump, he's always said, or maybe someone in his campaign like Manafort, who knows how to run campaigns and distract. Trump has always said any media attention is better than no media attention. And on a critical weekend before, like, we only had a few weekends left running up to the election. The last thing that the Trump campaign would want is, a whole weekend discussion bringing every former CIA operative and FBI operative of how Russia is attacking our election. So that is that part. And we also have to remember Roger Stone's role in this. He also was communicating with Guccifer and he was involved in the next chapters as we get closer to election, because here the first, what is it, chapter 9, we use it to lay the groundwork of how Russia did it. Now we're going to go into the operational chapters, showing, attack by attack. But Roger Stone was involved in Trump himself. I mean, how many times did he mention WikiLeaks? 130, 200 times he mentioned himself WikiLeaks and, kept signaling to them exactly the days where he wanted dumps to come out. So something we'll explore later. But, in this chapter, we specifically wanted to show just how Russia uses various cutouts. In this case, WikiLeaks was a direct cutout, and how Russia uses unwitting agents, which is the media. And this is not a problem just to US, because let me tell you, I've bashed BBC, I've bashed, many European outlets who the same thing. They end up putting these headlines that are literally doing the services of the Russian intelligence services, because a lot of people just read the headline and that's what they take from it. Maybe they'll look into the first paragraph. And when you have media who is too busy, using headlines without disclosures and reporting things from Russia, or reporting on things surrounding Russia that, whether it's their comments or something, an act of theirs. And when you divide these type of headlines, you end up doing the service for free without even realizing it.
Well, and I have to
So.
say, Dean Baquet, who was the executive editor of the New York Times, I don't know that he's ever quite accounted for what they did. and how they were used, because they were used. And again, I
Mhm.
want to say that if John Podesta's emails had anything in them that was relevant, the DNC hack did have some newsworthy things in it, right? It did show that people at the DNC, staffers at the DNC who were supposed to be neutral, were trashing Bernie, were putting their finger on the scale for Hillary, right? Uh, Newsworthy. Okay, I'll accept that as being newsworthy. I mean, it was derived from a GRU hack, but it was newsworthy. Podesta's was so useless. I mean, it was literally like risotto recipes and excerpts from Hillary Clinton's speech on Wall Street that everybody's like, oh, look at her speaking to Wall Street. Oh, okay. But I mean, so nonsensical. And yet the Times ran with it over and over every single day. And if they want to know, now that they're being sued by Donald Trump for some $1 billion of whatever they didn't do, if they want to know how they got into that mess, I would recommend that the Sulzberger family, that A.G. Sulzberger, who's now the publisher, the Sulzberger family's owned the Times for the last, 150 years, look in the mirror, because that's who caused it. And when Olga and I sit there and complain about legacy media all the time, that's why. It's not self-serving. It is because it was apparent to anybody with any kind of background in this what was happening. And I might add, the New York Times has people who are as well versed, if not better versed, in all of this as we are. And those people should have been listened to if they ever spoke up. I hope they did. But there's no excuse for what the Times did. I want to also talk about one more thing, Olga, before we go. And I know we're running out of time here, but I want to talk about Seth Rich. We talked about him before, but this is a personal one for me because, as I said, I was a Fox watching this all take place in real time, and I'm proud of the fact that I'm the only person at Fox who ever said on air that what was going on was a disgusting crime against the Rich family and against his memory. But, you know, Seth Rich was the DNC staffer who was murdered um, in 2016, in the early morning of July 10th, 2016. He was 27 years old, and he was shot in the back in Washington. I don't think they've caught his killers, but the assumption is that he was caught effectively in um, uh, a attempted robbery. He was just caught up in an attempted robbery that went really awry. Um, the Metropolitan Police in DC posted its customary reward and appeal for tips. Well, Assange, on August 9th, a little over a month after, no, I'm sorry, just a few weeks after uh, Seth Rich's death, appeared on Dutch TV and when he was asked about risks to WikiLeaks sources. He proactively volunteered Seth Rich's name. And then when pressed whether Rich was a source, said that WikiLeaks never commented on sources, which was a ploy, of course, designed to implicate Rich in the DNC emails. That same day, WikiLeaks announced a $20,000 reward for information leading to conviction in Rich's murder, which, of course, they never intended to pay because they were never going to get that information. But, of course, it pushed the conspiracy theory about Rich from the fringes much more into the mainstream conversation, which is exactly what the Kremlin intended. The reason this is so gross, and Assange kept it up. He went on the Fox affiliate in DC to talk about it, reinforcing the idea that there was something murky about it and that WikiLeaks, about WikiLeaks' sources. That was recycled across social media over and over again. But what was so gross about this, Olga, is that Assange, and this is why wherever Assange is in Australia right now, I hope he knows not a moment of peace, precisely because of this. He well knew while he was putting that out there, and Rich was already dead. He well knew that the GRU, using that Guccifer 2.0 persona and other cutouts, was providing WikiLeaks with the stolen DNC materials after Rich's death. They emailed WikiLeaks an encrypted archive of DNC files on July 14th, 2016, 4 days after Rich's death. And WikiLeaks acknowledged receipt on July 22nd, after Rich's death. and it was working to obtain files from Guccifer 2.0, even as he was floating this disgusting conspiracy that Seth Rich was the source, without outright saying that he was, and long after Rich already died. You know, there's no doubt, whatever Assange's role, that the Rich conspiracy theory was a direct Kremlin operation, because the SVR, again, Russian intelligence, 3 days after Rich's murder, put out a bulletin on July 13th, 3 days after his murder, which fabricated a lore tale, which is that Rich was supposedly killed by Clinton hit squad. That claim, of course, was then picked up by fringe websites and later by Russian state-aligned online networks. And then, of course, it went to Fox News. And then, of course, it went to mainstream media. And that's why going into 2017, I had to take shots at Sean Hannity over and over again for pushing this conspiracy theory out there, for which Sean Hannity has never apologized. Fox has apologized. Sean Hannity never has. That's why, Olga, I say that I hope Julian Assange knows not a moment of peace, because the Rich family has not known a moment of peace. Not just because their son and brother died, but because people like him were doing this and exploiting his death and torturing this family, which was then getting doxxed and then getting threatened because they thought, people believed, that Seth Rich had something to do with these WikiLeaks leaks.
And I just want to add to the operations, and just to show how good Russia is at information warfare. Because here you have, whether it's Seth Rich, whether it's Podesta, whether it's George Soros that they've gone over a decade, whether it was Bill Gates that they fabricated, a whole kind of disinformation operation around. They are excellent at taking a person or an event, and between the bots, the trolls, the useful idiots, the witting people, they are used to creating a full narrative. Trust me, this has been happening in Ukraine for decades, in the 2000s, the late 90s. Um, they're very good at this. And here you have, a tragedy where someone got murdered, you know, by just regular crime, no conspiracy behind it, and how Russia can take something like this and craft it around. And we're seeing it happen today with, the guy who killed Charlie Kirk and the conspiracies that Russia is running. This operation, by the way, Russia around Charlie Kirk, has to be probably, it's going to be studied and probably has to be one of their strongest operations in such a short period of time. The literally,
Yep.
if you look at the analytics and the amount of tweets and everything that they're doing. But this is what Russia does. And for instance, Podesta, how successful were they taking a man who's like, emailing about risotto recipes and like nonsense, and creating this boogeyman around him and creating this like mysterious conspiracy, like, as if he's some kind of a shadowy operative. Meanwhile, the guy literally, they stole his emails, and the emails were, for the most part, absolutely irrelevant. But if you take, and ask out of 20 people who do have heard of Podesta, 19 of them probably will come out and say, oh, there's something shady about him or whatever, because they're excellent at this, creating these narratives out of nothing. And whether it's, using cutouts like WikiLeaks, now you have MAGA influencers that they're using, you have, which we haven't touched on, but you have a whole far left, ecosphere where they push certain, lines of information through. But this is how, successful they are, or same thing with Hillary. I mean, you can ask anyone on any point of the planet, if they don't speak English and you say Hillary Clinton, automatically, oh, emails, that's it. Like, that's the only thing they associated, emails, corruption, shadowy, like, this shadowy corrupt figure, with her name. And, I just wanted to add that because this WikiLeaks operation, just was another way for them to solidify creating a narrative around things that really, individually weren't relevant.
And I'll tell you, I was in a meeting with John Podesta in 2017, so after not long after this all happened, and he felt, you know, angry, but be incredibly stupid that he could be hacked this way, and he should not be. He should not feel stupid. He should feel angry. He shouldn't feel stupid because the reality is he had Russian military intelligence hacking into his Gmail, where he wrote nothing of interest to anybody except that the New York Times, and I keep pointing them out because they really led the way on this. I mean, you expect this kind of stuff out of Fox News, but they really led the way in this. And the New York Times apparently believed that it was interesting that his risotto
Because it's
recipe was his
right.
risotto recipe. It was gossip. They look, the one thing the Russians know, and somebody here asked us in the chat whether we think that Russia killed Charlie Kirk. No, I mean, I
No,
no, no, it's not what we're suggesting. But
no,
out of chaos comes opportunity, and that is what they live
yeah.
by, right? Do I think that Russia planted risotto recipes in John Podesta's Gmail? No, but they got access to them, and then they used their useful idiots in the media, as they're doing again with Charlie Kirk's death, to promulgate nonsense. Right now, the nonsense is somehow that there is some vast left-wing conspiracy that led to Charlie Kirk's murder. Well, not even Kash Patel's FBI has been able to come up with some conspiracy.
I'll give you a better one. That Mossad um, hired this kid to go. I've never heard Mossad operating in this way, but they hired this non-professional kid to take his grandfather's rifle and go shoot Kirk because Kirk was demanding Epstein files.
Yeah,
This is
and
what Russia is pushing right now.
and the Mossad conspiracy has gotten so crazy that Bill Ackman, who I feel no sympathy for because P.S. Bill Ackman, you supported this prior to the election and you reap what you sow, had
And
to put
still
out a
support.
and still does, put out a statement saying and put out private emails between him and Charlie Kirk saying, no, Charlie Kirk and I did not have any fights over Israel. And because Bill Ackman's apparently the self-anointed defender of Israel these days. We had no fights, about Israel and we, kumbaya until the very last day. Like, because Bill Ackman is now getting doxxed and Bill Ackman is now getting death threats because people think he was responsible for Kirk's death. That's what they do. That's what they do. And the media keeps falling for it. They learned no lessons from 2016. I'm going to actually do a whole Substack on this because it's so upsetting to me. They learned nothing from it. They continue to do it. When I opened up the newspaper yesterday, in the newspaper, I mean the New York Times, my hometown newspaper, your hometown newspaper too, Olga. The entire top section was the memorial service, analysis of the memorial service, all these things about memorial service. And I'm sitting here thinking, ABC News, which had no problem taking Jimmy Kimmel off the air for a while, we'll see how long he continues to stay on, had also no problem running Stephen Miller, effectively quoting QAnon and using explicit white supremacist language, which was tied specifically to language that Joseph Goebbels had used. I don't use those analogies lightly. I never have, but you could read my Substack today to see what I'm talking about. And despite all of that, they just ran it again without commentary, without context, without nothing. I mean, as an advertisement for MAGA, which is what this was. An advertisement for division, an advertisement for hate. When you have the president of the United States standing up and saying, I hate my enemies, I don't wish them well. If I am Vladimir Putin sitting in the Kremlin, I stop whatever I'm doing that day, I consider it a job well done, and I go have a drink to celebrate how incredibly easy it was to elect somebody who creates the kind of divisions in this country where the president of the United States says that he hates his opponents, not even his enemies, I'm sorry, his opponents, which means he hates people in the Democratic Party and anybody who does not bend the MAGA knee, which is the vast majority of his country because his support tops out at less than 40%.
And I just want to add the last thing before we wrap up. And we really need to do a whole episode on the media and the failure of it. Besides the 2016 election, and them being useful idiots for that and, assisting in getting Trump into the White House, I mean, you have real geopolitical consequences because I cannot tell you, I want to bang my head to this day every time I've seen CNN put up a map, of occupied territory with separatist, a separatist controlled area. I promise you that the majority of people in America,
You're talking about in Ukraine,
yeah,
not
in
yeah.
Ukraine, I promise you the majority of people in America think that there were actual separatists, not Russian operatives and Spetsnaz and other military divisions who annexed Crimea and occupied Donbass, but that there are actual. New York Times said the same. You had, Russia annexed Crimea in 14, again, creating a whole fabricated situation that Ukrainians crucified a child. It was all debunked eventually, but you had some media outlets in the West run with this until they realized, I mean, this was a Russian operation. You have Russia. I guarantee you, if you ask any American who has never dealt with Syrians, thanks to the media, all the media outlets, people will tell you there was a civil war. Not that Assad, clamped down after the Arab uprising and massacred close to 750,000 people. Anyone who spoke out against his regime was massacred and then hit with chemical attacks and done everything in order to silence these people. I worked with Assyrians, the horror stories I've heard from people who have survived those prisons. This was not this. Syrian uprising started with kids, literally kids, grade level school kids who wrote, "We want freedom" on a wall. Is what sparked
And
off
and and and
this.
and yeah, and let me just say this because you raise a good point about occupied territories. If you ask the New York Times or CNN or anything else, if they show a picture of the West Bank in Israel, right? The Palestinian territories, they will refer to them as occupied territories. No question. Okay? Why don't they refer to this as occupied territories? Because I'll tell you, it's not just semantics. Referring to them as occupied territories in the Middle East has led to several generations of people understanding and believing that they're occupied territories, that they are occupied by a foreign occupier. Now, if you are somebody who disagrees with that um, uh, characterization, don't come at me. I'm just telling you semantically what this means. But they don't refer to the Donbass as occupied territories, right? They don't refer to the Crimea as occupied territories. And I think that's really important. Why not? Why not? Because if you believe after 1967 that the West Bank is occupied and an occupied territory, why don't you think that after certainly after 2013, why don't you think they're occupied, or at 2012 they're occupied territories? Why don't you think Crimea is an occupied territory? Why don't you refer to that as an occupied territory? Right? Why don't you consider parts of Georgia that were annexed occupied territories? All of this just underscores to you how bad the Israelis are, as much as people want to blame the Mossad, how bad the Israelis are at understanding, or they don't care about understanding Western sentiment, and how good the Russians are. Just
Yeah,
so good.
no, and this is why, to wrap up, it's important to call out media, and important to actually understand before, because like the separatist thing, like I said, that there are Russian separatists in occupied territories. There is no such thing. Literally, Russia fabricated this whole narrative. And you have every single thing, if from people who are reading this and to, outlets, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and New York Times, and every outlet who forever, this is what they were describing. And this literally is a successful Russian operation because here they fabricate a narrative. That narrative is pushed, pushed, pushed into the point that it's mainstream and accepted. And that's it. And for the longest time, even CNN, showed maps of occupied territories and said, oh, these are separatist controlled territories. And every single time I had to tweet out at them and say, can you remove that fucking map? Because there is no separatists unless you call GRU or Wagner or other
Well,
operatives
uh,
separatists.
I will tell you something. Um, you don't ever hear them referring to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria, which is what the Israeli government refers them to it as, right? They refer to it as the occupied West Bank. Fine, fine. But if you're going to do that there, why don't you do the same here? It's the occupied Crimean Peninsula. It's the occupied parts of the Donbass. It's the occupied city of Kherson, assuming it's occupied at the moment, right?
And if you want to give a little morale, as I always say, temporarily occupied because we will get them out.
Yeah,
We'll
and
send
I
them
will
back.
also say, Chris, you asked an interesting question before we go. It's a little bit off topic, but a little bit on. Can social media algorithms scrub these things they don't want to hear? You know what you should be panicked about this week, and I'm so sorry to do this to you.
TikTok.
Twitter. Twitter
Oh,
is about to be acquired by a consortium of MAGA supporting media
TikTok.
oligarchs. TikTok, excuse me, TikTok. Twitter is already owned by Elon
It's
Musk.
already.
Yeah, okay. Now it's the biggest one, TikTok. Larry Ellison, I think the Murdochs have a stake in it. So if you want to know what the algorithm is going to be doing, it's going to be doing whatever Donald Trump and MAGA want. And whether MAGA realizes it or not, what they want is what Russia tells them to want, because that is who's paying people like Benny Johnson and Tim Pool and Dave Rubin that we know of or were. We don't even know who else is getting paid by them, but all I know is Tucker Carlson, all these Russian influencers. I don't know if Tucker is being paid by them, but all of these influencers on the MAGA side, for the most part, ironically, all preach from the same pro-Kremlin choir book. That's what's
That
going to happen.
FBI indictment that mentioned Tim Pool, by the way, and Benny Johnson and the rest, I did say that there were 700 plus, if I remember correctly, influencers who were also involved. So
Yeah.
you could
So
just
there
get
you go. And to
so when you
anybody
log
here,
on to
and to anybody here who says, don't ever let my son have TikTok, trust me, he desperately wants it. And the answer is over my dead body. So don't worry about that. All right. On that note, Olga, it was great to see you. We stayed around a lot longer than I thought we would for this. We will see everybody on Thursday for another episode of Pax Americana. Watch out for another chapter in our Active Measure series dropping in your inboxes on Monday. Watch for another episode of this show on Tuesday at 12:30 Eastern. And to all our friends in the United States, and especially to all our friends around the world who are wondering what the hell just happened to this country, we don't know. Well, we're trying to make sense of it. I think this explains part of it. But it's good to see everybody here, and we will see you all again very soon. Bye, everybody.
my